I've made all sorts of model pine trees over the years, some good, some bad, some are fast and easy to make while others are very time consuming. These pine trees are some of the best ones I've made, however they are also some of the most time consuming trees to build, but definitely worth the effort for some ultra realistic model pine trees. Before we get started, there is a challenge in the video. Scattered throughout the tutorial, you'll see this little guy here. If you manage to spot him 7 times in the video, be sure to visit the competition page on my website. If you're quick, you might even have a chance at winning a prize. Here are the basic tools and materials you'll need. 7mm and 2mm straw static grass, 2mm light green and some 2mm dark green, some fine turf for the bark detail, 28 gauge florist's wire, brown, grey and olive green paints. You can use spray paint, however for this tutorial I used Vallejo paints as they have a much wider range of colours to choose from. I used 5mm diameter balsa dowel for the trunk. You need some spray adhesive and some super glue, along with some zip kicker to speed up this super glue drying time. And as for tools, you'll want some wire cutters, a good set of pliers and a sharp cutting blade. I start by cutting the balsa to size. I'm working on building a scene that is HO scale, so I roughly cut each trunk to about 16 centimeters, but I also make sure to vary the sizes between trees. Some are longer, around 20 centimeters tall, and some are as short as 12 centimeters. Using the knife, I taper the end of the trunk to a point. It doesn't have to be perfect, as most of the trunk will be covered in foliage and bark texturing. I also gouge out sections along the length of the trunk so there are subtle variations and it doesn't look too perfect. The great feature of using balsa wood for this process is that it carves very easily and adding branches is fast and easy, as you will see later. In the very base of the trunk I also add a pin. I first cut the head of the pin off and then initially press the pin into the trunk so the pointy end is poking out. Then a small drop of super glue is added before again pressing the pin back into the trunk so that it is permanently fixed into position. And just so I don't accidentally stab myself, I attach a bit of extra balsa over the pointy end while I continue to work on building the tree. With the 28 gauge wire and some wire cutters I start to cut individual branches. The wire gauge is not too fine, however it is fine enough that I can straighten the wire with my fingers. Now the slow process begins of cutting the branches. I'll probably need at least 50 individual branches per tree. Each one is cut to about 3 centimeters long. This block of wood will help raise the trunk off the table, making it easier to attach the branches. Or you could also use the edge of your workbench. Having a nice pair of pliers like this will make the job of adding branches much easier. As for the glue, you'll want a gel super glue, or you could also use a tacky glue, but I find the super glue speeds up the process a little better. Now all we need to do is set up our trunk on the block, use the pliers to grab a piece of wire, dip it into the gel super glue, and finally press the wire into the balsa wood trunk. The trick here is to grab the wire close to the base of each branch, only leaving just enough to be pressed into the trunk. I also press them in on a slight angle, so they are angled towards the base of the trunk. It's quite a lengthy process, but once you get into a rhythm, it goes faster than it seems. When I build trees like this, I'll usually put on some music and build about 10 trees at a time. Once branches have been added right to the top of the trunk, I'll give it a spray with some zip kicker to make sure the super glue is fully set, and then I'll start pruning and shaping the individual branches. Most pine trees are quite pointed towards the top, so I do my best to replicate that shape as I start cutting the branches. Sometimes it might help to look at an actual photo of the type of tree you're trying to model to get a more accurate shape. On this tree, I wanted the branches to droop down and curve outwards. The bits of wire we cut off can be used to add small dead branch details around the base of the trunk. To colour the trunk, I used a mixture of Vallejo brown sand and dark sea grey, but any brown or grey will work fine as the base coat. After painting the trunk, I also make sure to give the wire branches a light coat of paint as well. Now for some bark texture. I'm using some Woodland Scenics fine turf soil, but you could also use real sawdust or even sifted dirt to get a similar effect. Spray adhesive can get everywhere, so I do my best to contain it, but I definitely recommend doing this outside. The adhesive is applied over the entire trunk. Once it has a good coat of glue, fine turf is sprinkled over the top. On this particular tree, I added a second coat of fine turf, however it really wasn't necessary. So for the additional trees, I only applied one layer of the bark texture. The next layer of glue is for the smaller branches. You want to try and apply this layer of glue to the outer edges of each branch, doing your best to avoid getting the glue on the trunk of the tree. "7mm straw coloured static grass from Woodland Scenics was used here. For some future trees, I might also experiment with some of the 4mm fibres as well. The fibres are sprinkled over the branches, being very careful to avoid getting the fibres onto the trunk. This is one of those times you don't want to rush, otherwise you'll end up with grass fibres in areas you don't want. This step is repeated a second time to build up the density of the tree. You could potentially do this even more times if you desire to have a really dense tree, or just do this step once for a much less dense tree. For me, I found 2 applications was just the look I was after, and don't forget we still have the 2mm static grass to apply. A light tap on the bench will help remove any excess. To help direct the grass fibres, I used an old paintbrush to press down on any fibres that were sticking up. This doesn't have to be perfect, as a few fibres sticking up can also look good, but this step does help accent each individual branch. In this step you can use spray paint, however I've opted for some Vallejo olive brown to colour the branches. You can get some really nice effects with this technique. You could make really interesting dead tree in your forest by stopping at this step. With the last layer of paint applied, I add spray adhesive to the branches, again trying to avoid getting the glue on the trunk of the tree. Now it's time for some colour. Around the base of the tree I first apply some 2mm straw static grass. This layer is only applied to the very bottom branches to simulate branches that don't get much sunlight. Next, some 2mm light green is applied just above the previous layer as a blending layer, and then above that some 2mm dark green is applied. The dark green is lightly applied over the top of the previous layers as well. Now for the final time, a layer of spray adhesive is applied, and a final sprinkling of the 2mm dark green static grass is applied. This final layer of grass is applied over the entire canopy of the tree. You can vary how much is applied over the lighter green and straw coloured areas to vary the effect of colour change between the top and the bottom of the tree. One thing with static grass is that it's shiny and reflects in the sunlight. If your tree is for an indoor layout, this isn't usually an issue. However, because I plan to use these trees on a diorama that will be used for outdoor photography, I need to dull down the reflective shine. To do this, I very lightly mist some Vallejo olive drab over the tree. It only needs a very light mist, and I mainly apply it in a top-down motion. And before we're ready to plant our tree onto the layout, I remove any obvious stray fibres from the trunk. You can make all sorts of trees using this technique. I really like how easy it is to make unique looking trees. So next time you need some great looking pine trees, be sure to give this a try. If you manage to spot Wally, don't forget to let me know by filling out the form at bouldercreekrailroad.com. Cheers, and thanks for watching.